We know with certainty that every child has a dad. We may not know who it is. It would be nice if we always knew who it was. It would also be very nice if that legally there could only be one dad. But that's not the case, and hence this training. Welcome to Legal Aspects training on Who's Dad? I'm Jeannie Gordon. I'm the Legal Issues Training Coordinator with the Children's Division. Today is February 1st, 2012. Just a second on your materials. They're on the Children's Division intranet under Practice and Professional Development, Legal Aspects DVD series. I want you to know that training on Who's Dad is one of the favorite topics for me anyway, that I train. I really enjoy it. I would like to introduce you to Pam Smith, who's here with me today. Pam has a master's in social work. She's been with the Children's Division for 15 years. She started out as a worker. She was a supervisor for 8 years, and she spent the last 5 years as the training tech in the Western region. So she's got great skills in training. And in the process over the last couple of years, Pam put together a training on dads, and I think she's as passionate about it as I am. And she asked me for some legal help, so I helped her out. So now she's returning the favor by helping me out with this training today. So what we're going to talk about today are the laws and how they apply on Who is Dad. We're going to apply some real-world concepts as examples, and we'll have an activity at the end so you get a chance to apply it. We're going to differentiate on the terms that are used in real-world situations and terms that apply in juvenile court proceedings, and that will be close to the end. And we're going to talk about how you use this information and the social work issues that come up in this. Pam, why don't you start us out on what the social work issues are?
Wonderful. You know, whenever I did start researching this for training, I was a little confused. I didn't really feel like we needed a training on how to work specifically with dads, because in my head you work with dads the same way you work with moms. But through the research and from educating myself, it's clear that the system as a whole doesn't treat dads the same, and that dads have kind of been peripheral to our child welfare system. And it's time to pull Dad in and make him part of our process and bring him into the circle, if you will. One of the things that the research has told us is that dads are more likely to be engaged if we can find and locate him within the first 30 days of our case. If that happens, then we have the most success.
I think that's really important.
Beyond that, and sometimes that's just not possible for multiple reasons. If that's not possible, then that ongoing case manager should continue that process of locating and finding dads. But with the recognition that locating dad is only half the battle, the next step is that we really have to engage dad in our case process.
So as we go through this training today, as I talk about the legal issues, you're going to pick up on how to engage and work with these dads.
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's move on to a couple of housekeeping things. The second slide has an index of topics to help you go to one specific point in the training if there's something that's particularly important to you. The goals of the training include that you will understand how the law views fathers and why, how these concepts apply in gathering information and working cases, and hopefully you'll improve your search when you have unknown or absent fathers. Pam, I think the limitations on the training are important too, because the training materials work in almost all cases, but there's always a few exceptions. The training materials are based on Missouri laws. I can't always tell you what goes on in other states. This information is really intended to benefit the worker in the job they do. It's not intended for them to use it to give legal advice to their clients. The PowerPoint is meant as a resource, and on some of the slides there'll be statute numbers in the blue boxes, which I guess I think they're important, and so we'll start from there. Let's talk about legal fathers in the real world. Pam, as you know, there's over 100,000 hotline calls that come in a year. And 50 to 60,000 of those, just think of all those calls, are points of contact with the family where we're doing an investigation or an assessment, and consequently we may be doing a family-centered service case, we may be providing intensive in-home services, or the child may come into care. But all of these involve a mother and a father, and we need to be kind of looking at who's dead in these cases. Only a small percentage of these cases end up in juvenile court, which is the reason we're talking about legal fathers in the real world to start this training off. So we're going to begin with some very common conception of who a legal dad is. It's the person on an everyday basis who is recognized as dad, you know, the kind that has custody of the child, they medical treatment, they sign the kid up for school, they pick him up from school. If something happens to that dad, the child may be able to inherit from that dad, or there may be Social Security benefits that would go to that child. And to start that point, society really recognizes a man as the dad if he's on the birth certificate. I want to point out that this is not a limitation for us, meaning we only have to work with dads that are on the birth certificate. Really, we're wanting to work with anybody we know is a father and any possible fathers that are out there. Pam, why don't you start us off then with the types of dads that we commonly encounter?
Sure. The Children's Division is going to encounter all types of dads, whether they're on the birth certificate or not. The first one that we're going to encounter is actually the married father. Although a lot of workers tell me they don't see a whole lot of married fathers, that they haven't encountered an intact family nearly as often as they encounter some of the other types of dads. When we're working with dads who are married to the mother and they're in that committed relationship, what we have to know is that child maltreatment might be a symptom that something's wrong in the marriage. And so one of the things that we should focus on is coming to understand the status of the marriage and from the perception of both the mom and the father. But typically, married fathers, that is associated with most positive outcomes for children.
Well, that's good. What about if they're not married and they're just cohabitating?
The research is really split on this one. On many levels, it's just like a married father. But on the other hand, the research tells us it might be just like, but it's not quite. And the reason why that is really more theory and subjection. We're not really sure. But we do know that's what's important when we encounter a cohabitating parent is that we come to understand how each parent views that relationship. Does he view it as temporary or does he view it as long-term? And I think that can be helpful when we're working with cohabitating parents.
What about incarcerated parents?
We work with a lot of incarcerated parents, mainly fathers, but occasionally that might be a mom, but since we're talking about dads today, we'll talk about him. Most of the men who are in prison did not live with their children prior to going to prison. So the relationship that they have with their child is estranged at best. It may not even be there. They may not have ever met the father or the child. It's also important to know that most men who are in prison also don't come from households and with a strong male presence. So what you have is a man who's incarcerated and who may not know how to be dad. So our work should focus around educating and preparing that man for fatherhood after he gets out of prison.
Should we also give him a chance to try to be a father while he's in prison?
Absolutely, and you know, the Department of Corrections varies from site to site, but several of them actually have programs that will assist dad in having contact and supervising that and kind of learning some parenting skills with the children prior to even being released from prison.
Here's a legal aside, and you know the answer to this, but that father, even when he's incarcerated, has constitutional rights to that relationship with the child.
He does.
So this is a way of putting the legal piece with the social work piece, so I think that's a great thing.
Yeah.
What about multiple fathers?
I think this is the category that workers tell me they see the most of. It's probably the most confusing, especially whenever you're talking multiple children with different fathers for each child. It tends to be a little chaotic. Inside the household and outside the household. And so what we have to kind of come to understand when we're working with multiple dads is what role does each one of those fathers play in the family and with that child. There might be one dad who is an emotional father to all the children, and so we kind of need to take a look at that. There may be also tension whenever one of the dads might be the alleged perpetrator of the abuse that we're working with, and then that will anger the other dads as well. So it can be a very chaotic and frustrating time, and kind of weeding through that is very important on our end.
Okay. What about when mom has a boyfriend?
Boyfriends, stepfathers, the research on them looks an awful lot alike. It's a mix, how's that? There are dads or boyfriends and stepfathers out there who are wonderful role models to children. They step up to the plate and they do a great job. But on the flip side of that, we have boyfriends who are stepfathers who become the perpetrators of the abuse. Whether we like it or not, they provide a role in that child's life. And so one of the things that we have to take into consideration is that we really need to slow things down when we're working with boyfriends and stepdads, and that we need to assess closer. We need to come to understand how the mom views the boyfriend, how the mom views the stepdad, how do the children look at that male in their lives, and how he contributes or does not contribute.
That's a lot of information. You know, here I am just thinking about, well, legally, who's dad? And there's all these other issues on the social work side that we really need to take a look at the same time. So I think that's great. Well, let's move on and talk about what terms we use when we characterize who's dad. Slide 12 has the common terminology on dads. These are the most common terms used: legal dad, biological or natural father, putative or alleged father. We need to note at this point that if a child comes into care, then with the juvenile court involvement, this terminology may change due to statutory definitions. We've got a slide on the man who's listed as the father on the birth certificate when there's no court orders to the contrary. And we're talking about the fact that, you know, he can probably make the same decisions that mom can. They can talk about who's got custody of the child, who actually has physical custody of the child at any point in time when there's no orders. They can make decisions for the child, and they have there's no ability to legally enforce which parent has custody. I think these are really result in high conflict situation that the workers deal with at the local level alike. Pam, can you give us some perspective on that?
Absolutely. Whether it's a marriage, a long-term relationship, or even a short-term relationship, people generally don't separate well. There's a lot of fighting, there's a lot of arguing, and even times you see a lot of vindictive behaviors. And that just seems to be even more intense when children are involved, because at times they can be pawns in that arguing. Our best effort is to educate both mom and dad on the benefit that mom plays and the benefit that dad plays, and that how later on in that child's life, mom and dad really might need each other's support in order to make it through that. So for example, that preschooler who's having temper tantrums and it just wears on you, or the adolescent who's going through raging hormones, mom and dad really might want to have a break or stand next to each other in a united front in dealing with those types of behaviors.
Those are really good examples. The next slide talks about a summary of legal dads, and what we're saying is that he's a legal dad if he's on the birth certificate, even if he's not the bio dad, until he legally undoes it, and sometimes he can't. So we're gonna talk about all the different ways men's names get on birth certificates and get off birth certificates, but this is kind of what it boils down to. We're going to start with the legal dad. That means he's on the birth certificate. So how do names get on the birth certificate? Well, that's based on the legislature, because they passed the laws and they've decided who they will recognize as the child's father. And the laws that allow a man's name on the birth certificate cover if the parents are married or not at birth of the child, if there's court orders, judgments, decrees declaring who's the dad, or if there's child support enforcement orders. One misconception that I think we need to clear up at the very beginning of the case is, based on these laws, mom cannot just place a man's name on the birth certificate at the hospital. The law no longer allows that kind of thing. Now, it may have been true prior to 1997 or so. So we may occasionally see kids that are 14 or older, who there may be some talk with the mother or about the father, about he wasn't the dad and mom just threw his name on there. But just so you know, after 1997, these laws have been in effect, which means they should be being followed.
So you're saying that mom can name the baby whatever she wants. She just can't list dad as a father on the birth certificate unless they're married? or unless he's there and signs an affidavit.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that's a good point, because she can give the child any last name she chooses. And that comes up as a general rule in the trainings that I do.
Excellent.
So let's take a look at names on the birth certificates. I think we're on slide 18. So there's 4 ways a name gets on the birth certificate. We're talking about married parents. Society recognizes the marriage, and they're going to make it easy to get that man's name on the birth certificate. The second one is if the parents are unwed and they sign affidavits. So they've added a few hoops if you're not married at the time of the child's birth for a man to get his name on the birth certificate by using that affidavit acknowledging paternity. Thirdly, sometimes parents go to a court agreeably, or they're duking it out over who's the dad. And in those cases, you're going to see court judgments and decrees that say who's dad. And then the last way, the fourth way, is child support enforcement orders. They're called administrative orders because it doesn't go through the courts. And a lot of times, I think from a social work perspective, we're dealing with the mothers that are in need of public welfare benefits. Pam, can you talk to that?
Absolutely. One of the public benefits that's available is TANF, which is Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. And children are entitled to it when they're deprived of parental support. So if the dad's not in the household, mom can go into the Family Support Division and make an application for a TANF benefit. When they put forth that application and sign it, they're signing an affidavit that says that they will work with the child support enforcement in order to locate and find out who dad is, because the goal would be to recover those costs. And so one of the things then, so when mom makes the application for TANF, she's opening a child support enforcement case, and child support enforcement is dependent upon mom to get names of the dads, and they will start locating or contacting the men that mom identifies as potential fathers. They do that first by a letter. And oftentimes what we find out is that dads throw that letter away. They don't believe that they're the dad. They don't have anything to do with it. They may not even like the mom because they're separating that separation's getting nasty. And so they'll throw that letter away. And then child support enforcement will find them to be the legal father through something called default. And so then you have a dad who may not be a dad, who's now stuck being recognized as the legal father of that child. So when we're working with those families, or with fathers, what we need to do is really kind of encourage dad and educate him on that child support enforcement process. Because if dad doesn't believe he's the dad, all he has to do is respond to the letter and ask for a paternity test, and the paternity test will prove whether he's the dad or not.
So that all needs to be discussed with the dad in some detail.
Absolutely, because we want to encourage dad not to throw that letter in the mail, because if he becomes the legal father to a child that he doesn't believe is his, he's only going to get angry, and then we have a harder time engaging him.
The other thing too is he's going to have a hard time undoing it.
Absolutely.
And that's something to think about. And just as an aside, I love that you're talking that legal stuff when you talk default. I want everybody to understand on these child support enforcement orders, that letter that you're talking about is called a notice of financial responsibility for the child. And it amounts to that due process piece that every parent is constitutionally entitled to before they can be made to pay child support or something like that. So that notice of finding of financial responsibility is just, hey guy, you may be the dad.
Right.
And it doesn't mean anything else. For it to actually be enforceable, you need an administrative order. There has to be order in the title.
Yes.
But you're right, you get that order in place and it's harder to undo.
Absolutely.
Okay. And we'll go into some detail on that as we get farther on in the training. So let's start with the child born during the marriage, because we talked about there's 4 ways for a name to get on the birth certificate. So let's start with the child born during the marriage. Under the law, the husband's name shall, please note it says shall, go on the birth certificate because he was married to mom at any time between conception and birth. And I thought that was real interesting because I didn't know about the conception part when I was actually putting these training materials together. So I thought that was very informative to me. But what does any time mean on a practical level? Well, in a lot of cases, mom and dad may be married a year or more before they get pregnant and have a baby. So that's any time between conception and birth. But mom and dad could also get married, the day before the child's born And that would still be at any time between conception and birth. And then, you see the movies where mom and dad are getting married as she's in the throes of giving childbirth as they go down the hall in the hospital. I mean, it's still prior to the birth of the child, so it would count. I think that's a pretty good one.
Excellent.
Sometimes when the parents are married, dad's name doesn't end up on the birth certificate. So I think we need to talk about that a little bit. And what's come up in training is that mom and dad may be married, but they have different last names.
Right.
And in one particular case, the hospital would put the dad's name on because they couldn't come up quickly with a marriage certificate that showed they were married. So sometimes they're going to have to show that marriage certificate in order to be able to get the name on there. Sometimes too, we know that when mom's having this baby, the man she's married to may actually not be the father, and so she may not tell the hospital that she's married, and consequently, there's no man there, so the name doesn't go on the birth certificate. But again, the law says the husband's name shall go on the birth certificate unless a court has determined paternity, meaning you'd have a court judgment or decree, or the husband has signed that denial of paternity affidavit that will go with the process when the parents of the child are unmarried. There's one piece of this that's kind of hard, I think, for social workers sometimes, and that's the example where mom and dad are married, but he's not the father of the child. He's later ruled out by paternity testing that he's not dad. Pam, do you have a comment on this, because he's still legally a dad?
I think that happens to us quite frequently, where we find ourselves looking with a mom's married to one man, but maybe she had a relationship with another man, and she could even then get into a relationship with a third man and put his name on the birth certificate as long as he signs the affidavit. And what's important for us is that when we're working with them, we have to kind of identify all those men, because if we reach a point in our case where we're looking to terminate parental rights, we might have to terminate parental rights on all those men, because they play a role in it somehow.
Yes, I agree, and I've done those terminations where I've had to terminate on those legal dads. So let's move on to the children born out of wedlock. As we've said, it's important to have a dad's name on a birth certificate. It's just a little harder to do when the child's born out of wedlock. So we're going to start on slide 22 with the affidavit acknowledging paternity. So this is the easiest way to do it. It's the most frequent way to do it. I think it's very inexpensive. And it's my understanding that this process has to be explained at the hospital to the parents. So I think that's really great. So we should be seeing more and more of these type of parents end up on the birth certificate. So by law, the man's name goes on the birth certificate when he and mom both fill out affidavits. He says he's dad, she says he's dad. They're doing it at the hospital, or you can do it at any other point. You just have to get a copy of it from Child Support Enforcement. And they both sign it, and then it's filed with the Bureau of Vital Records, and the name goes on the birth certificate. It's commonly called a hospital affidavit because that's where you normally see the usage. But it can be used at any other point thereafter. And sometimes when we're involved in cases, again, if the parents aren't married and mom and dad are playing nice in the sandbox, that's something we can suggest to them if dad is not on the birth certificate, and it would be a good thing for him to be on it. Let's talk about examples, because again, we wanted to talk examples as we went through the training. So if mom and dad are not married at the time of the child's birth, then the affidavit is required. Mom and dad get married the day after the child is born. The affidavit is still required. So what matters is whether or not they're married at the time of the child's birth. We're going to look at the statutory requirements in a little more detail, and then we're going to look at what happens when mom is married to someone else when the child is born.
Okay.
So if mom and dad are not married, and mom signs her affidavit and dad signs his, that he's the natural father, that's part of the requirement for to put the name on the birth certificate. Both swear under penalty of perjury that these statements are true. It's signed in the presence of two adult disinterested witnesses or a notary. The really interesting thing about that is I just assumed at the hospital it would be a notary, and it turns out the most common usage is just two disinterested people that happen to be there. It's probably a social worker and someone else. I'm
hospital staff.
Hospital staff. That's a good way to look at it. And then if the child's born at the hospital, I think they take care of getting all the information for the birth certificate filed, and that those affidavits are filed together at Vital Records. So that's the easiest way to do it. Now, I want to point out that they're both swearing that he's the dad. Are they telling the truth?
Not always.
That's right. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. I know of one case where mom had a number of children removed, and she was getting ready to have a new baby. And so she had a sister that lived in another city in Missouri, and at the hospital she gave her sister's name. So her sister's name went on the birth certificate as the mother of the child. So that's an interesting one. And I know this is a dad training, but this is the kind of stuff that we encounter. Another situation would be is where dad's in love. He didn't meet mom until after she was already pregnant, but he's so in love with her that he swears he wants to be the baby's daddy, and he signs an affidavit that says he's the dad. That can happen too. Also, sometimes mom and dad honestly get it wrong. You know, mom thinks he's dad and he thinks he's dad, and at some point later down the road they find out that he really isn't. So Pam, any kind of comments you would make on that?
No, I think it's just important to keep looking, and we've had cases where we've had to rule out multiple dads before we found the right one. I actually worked with a gentleman. He was the 5th named dad that we had gone through in a whole line of trying to find the dads. And so I think what we need to realize is that things do happen. The parents aren't always honest with each other. And then whenever that relationship goes south, then he wants his name off that birth certificate or anything like that. And, you know, it's just important to get the dad identified as fast as possible.
I agree. You're absolutely right. The next slide talks about what happens when the husband really isn't the dad. Well, it turns out there's more than just an affidavit for a mom and a dad, that affidavit acknowledging paternity. There's also something called the husband's affidavit denying paternity. So the husband signs that he's the father, he's the husband of the mother, but he's not the father of the child on the denial of paternity affidavit. So he's swearing that. And then that goes in at this into the affidavit of Vital Records. It can be done at the hospital, right along with the mom saying, this other man is the father and my husband's not. And the husband says, I'm the husband, but I'm not the child's father. And the other man says, I'm not married to her, but I am the child's father. You put the 3 packaged together, and the statute says you can turn that in. So let's talk about an example of that. So mom and dad are married, and they have one child that's born during the marriage. And when the child hits 2 or 3, there's problems in the marriage, and the parents separate. So maybe dad's got a girlfriend, and mom ends up with a boyfriend down the line, and mom's talking about getting divorced, and lo and behold, it turns out she's pregnant. Well, it turns out there's a law that says that you can't get divorced while you're pregnant. So mom has the baby at the hospital, and mom signs an affidavit saying this boyfriend is the dad, not my husband. The boyfriend signs that he's not the husband, but he's the dad. And then in this particular case, this is a real case, the husband actually came to the hospital and signed that he was not the dad, even though he was the husband. And I think sometimes it's important for those men to do it for child support enforcement reasons, if nothing else. When you file all 3 of those together, the boyfriend's name goes on the birth certificate, and it's treated as a legal finding of paternity. So just think about it, how these things happen. It all goes together. Sometimes there's no dad out there. We don't know who the dad is. But the use of the affidavits by mom and dad and the denial by the husband are turning out to be much more common this day. It's actually come up in 3 or 4 trainings, because I wasn't even going to put this in the training. But then when the examples kept turning up in training, I thought, well, they obviously are doing a lot more of this at the hospitals than I thought. But again, these 3 affidavits can be combined together and sent to Vital Records way after the child's born, if the parties want to get together and do it. But I don't know, it generally comes down to whether the husband and wife are playing nice in the sandbox.
Right.
Okay. And how does dad legally undo it? Think about the husband. I mean, he's still married to mom. There's still that presumption of paternity. We'll talk about that term later. But when mom and dad get divorced, the court's going to make a finding that first child was, when you go back to my example, that first child was born of the marriage. And then the court's going to say the second child was not born of the marriage. So that's the equivalent of a legal finding of non-paternity. So, and that has actually come up in trainings where workers have said, you know, Mom, let me look at the paperwork, and it said in her paperwork that he was not the father of the child. So I think that's something else, you know, workers need to be at least cognizant of. If you know the man who's married to Mom and isn't the father of the child, if you know they're divorced and you're trying to figure out if he's still a dad or whether there's been some kind of legal action on that.
I think it's always helpful if there are those divorce custody papers and with a family that we're working at, that we ask to see them and that we read them to see what they actually say.
That's a great idea. The next slide is 26, and again, we're talking about if the parents sign these affidavits of acknowledging paternity, then if they're not married, for that father, it's considered a legal finding of paternity. And I put in the statute that talks about that, and that a finding in Missouri would be the same in other states. So examples, Mom and Dad are not married, they sign the affidavits, and Dad names goes on the birth certificate. 2 years later, DNA testing rules him out as a bio dad. He's still going to be a legal dad unless he does something legally to undo it. On the section about it being a legal finding of paternity, please know that when we hit the juvenile court piece of this, some of the judges are going to disagree. And there's some specific case law out there that would make that understandable. And I think in your training materials, I really liked where you talked about if Mom and Dad are married, he's going to be the legal father unless an order says he's not, a court order says he's not. And I think that's a really good way to talk about that. The benefits of the affidavit process, and again, this comes from child support enforcement. It talks about how, you know, if the man's the dad and he's on the birth certificate, there's child support for the child. There's the availability of medical insurance. We talked about inheritance rights, Social Security, and veterans benefits that would be available to the child. But again, visitation and custody rights are only decided by a court action.
I think those benefits are what's helpful to educate Mom about, because I think when they are separating and it's going poorly and there's a lot of arguing and bitterness, those benefits are one of the reasons that we can give to Mom as to why she wants to maintain a relationship with the dad over the long haul.
I agree. Let's talk a little bit more about the form itself. Again, the hospitals are required to provide the form at birth, and then, like I said, there's a real push for them to make it clear to the parents that this is a great process and they should be using it. Again, after the child goes home, you can get the forms and use them. So when we're talking about these affidavits, is there a way you can undo them? Well, the statute says if you do it pretty quickly, if you realize within about 60 days you've made, or less, that you've made a mistake, you can fill out a piece of paper that's going to undo it for you. It's just to get the name off the birth certificate, you may still have to go to court. So an example, Mom and Dad are not married. They both sign the acknowledgement of paternity at the hospital. They both know he's not the bio dad, but again, he's blindly in love. So his name goes on the birth certificates. Let's say 6 months later, they have a big falling out and they split up, and she needs some help supporting this child. She's going to go to child support enforcement or she's going to apply for benefits, which means there has to be a child support enforcement referral. He's going to be stuck because it's after the 60 days and he's not going to be able to undo that piece, and he's going to have to get some paternity testing and move from there. So the next topic we're going to talk about is court judgments and decrees. And again, the divorce piece has come up a little bit already. One thing to remember, that court judgments are final for all purposes. And there's only one very small exception where those can be undone. But for the most part, they're final orders, and once that court has litigated over who's dad, you're pretty much stuck with being dad, and you almost can't undo it under any circumstances. So let's talk about divorce first when we talk about court orders, because we're going to talk divorce, paternity, and adoption. So when parents get divorced, it's called a dissolution of marriage. That's that, big legal mumbo-jumbo words that we use. Custody is determined over the children of the marriage, and we talked a little bit about that in that example that I gave you. The The judgment can order the father's name removed from the birth certificate. So in the example that I gave, where the one child was born of the marriage and the other one wasn't, in the body of the judgment or decree, the court can order that the circuit clerk be directed to send to Vital Statistics this information to amend the birth certificate and take that husband's name off if his name was on there. And again, we talked about how there's a statute that says mom and dad can't get divorced if mom's pregnant. Now, again, are the parents always truthful in these things? Sometimes not, but there's a way to catch that legally also, and we'll talk about that as we go. But why aren't the divorces granted while mom's pregnant? Well, think about it. It's kind of against public policy to bastardize a child, and that's what you would be doing in many cases. Okay, this is consistent with some other statutes that talk about the name of the husband married to mom at the time of the child's birth shall go on the birth certificate. There's also a presumption of paternity if the child was born within 300 days of death or dissolution. And so I think that goes along with that piece that you can't bastardize the children by getting divorced while you're pregnant. An example of these kind of cases in this child born within 300 days of dissolution, we had a child in care where the mother gave us the names of who the fathers were, and she was divorced at the time the child was born. But it was one of those cases where the date when they got divorced was kind of on the fishy side, so we had her get a copy of her divorce decree. And then I actually counted how many days after the date that the divorce judgment signed was the child born, and the child was born within 250 days. So we had to do a TPR on that man that was a husband of mom at some point when the child after the child had been conceived. So that's how all those pieces match up. He signed a TPR consent, though. That's the end of the story on that one. The next type of court judgment we talk about are involved in paternity cases. You know as well as I do that if mom and dad are playing nice in the sandbox when the child's born and they're not married, they can do the affidavit acknowledging paternity. But at the time of the child's birth, that's not always the case. What if they're fighting or split up before the child's born and she's not willing to put his name on the birth certificate and do that paperwork because she doesn't want him involved in the child's life? So at that point, he's got to find some other way to get his name on a birth certificate, and so he might go forward and say, I'm going to file a court action so that I can be declared to be to the dad. Sometimes on the reverse, the man won't do anything and mom wants him to. And so the only thing she can do, if for some reason it's important to her family, they may do it as a court legal action as opposed to going through child support enforcement. So that's part of what paternity cases are all about. It's a way for the courts to decide who's the dad. When a man wants to claim the child as his, or there's more than one man claiming to be the dad of the child, or a man needs to get his name off the birth certificate because he isn't the dad, or paternity testing needs to be done to figure out. This is a way to do this. And I just want to make a note that this is different than paternity cases that are determined by child support enforcement. Is there some type of comment, Pam, that you think is important?
Yeah, I think that two things I have. One is that this is really, we have to acknowledge this is a very frustrating time for dads. Whenever they want to be the dad and mom's not playing nicely, and he's frustrated, and he may not know or understand, because we know that people who are married have to get a divorce whenever they no longer want to be in a relationship. But you don't think about people who aren't married having to go to court to establish visitation rights. And so dad may not really have any idea or knowledge as to what the steps need to be. So he really might need a lot of education and recommendations to go to see attorneys so that he can figure that out.
And that's a very good point. It makes a whole lot of sense.
I think it's also important, Jeannie, to talk about mom, though, because mom does serve the role through paternity as well as just in the engagement of dad in this case. Mom serves the role as a gatekeeper. She can keep information from everybody, or she can give it, or she can lead us down a wrong path or anything like that. And so mom is a vital role. Mom's information is vital to us. And I think sometimes when mom just puts that foot down and she's not going to tell us anything, and she'll say something like, I have no idea who the dad is, or we haven't talked to him in over 10 years. You know, sometimes we just take that at face value, but I think what we have to know is that that's no longer acceptable, and we have to find ways around mom. And so maybe we need to talk to mom's mom or mom's sisters, or, you know, other people that might be involved with mom in order to find out that information. And so part of our reasonable efforts, if you will, is that we find ways around in locating dad, identifying him, and engaging him that maybe don't include mom when she is serving the role as a gatekeeper.
And I think that's very important. And that would apply at any point of service in a case, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay. So when we're talking paternity cases, and again, another example could be that maybe mom and dad are underage, and dad's parents want to make sure they're treated as grandparents and they get some custody and visitation rights for their son and for themselves. They'll go into court and do a paternity action. That's another one that's important to include. But one other thing about paternity cases is you can't go to court on a paternity case if there's already an existing court judgment. We've got that on slide 34. A court judgment or decree that someone has been legally made the dad of the child based on a court judgment. Those kind of things you can't change. We talked about how you can't change that. So you can only go do a paternity action in court when there's no other final judgments involved, court actions involved. It means that it's been appealed. You know, if there's a final judgment in legal terms, that means the court issued a judgment and the time for appeal is run, so it's no longer able to be appealed. So that's what we mean by that. Sometimes paternity actions are filed in court when a man thinks he's dad. He may or may not be, but there's been no paternity testing. So in these types of paternity cases, a man can do that, and then the court can require paternity testing. That's one of the nice things about these paternity actions. Here's where we talk about those presumptions of paternity on slide 36. There are terms that are used because there's certain conditions of some of these men that make them more likely to be a father than not. And I think that's kind of a plain English explanation of presumptions of paternity. And the court's going to look at the different presumptions that apply if you have more than one dad, compare the two, and decide who's dad. Let's move on to what these presumptions are, Pam. And they start on slide 37. The child was born during the parents' marriage, so that's one of those presumptions, because we know sometimes that man may not be the dad and he may want to get his name off a birth certificate. The child's born within 300 days of the parents' divorce. That's one of those where they get divorced while mom's pregnant.
Right.
So the court's still going to treat that man as a presumed father. Or that the child's born within 300 days of the husband's death. And that makes sense, because if the father dies, you want that child to have a father that's recognized, and think of the benefits that go with it. The next one is paternity testing. 98% or higher that the man is the biological father. So you got your blood testing. That also is considered one of those. And then this other one is kind of an odd one, but sometimes the marriages are not valid for some reason. Maybe the minister's certificate isn't good, or there's some problems, but it's when they tried before, the parents tried before or after the child was born to get married, but it was invalid for some reason. The last of the presumptions of paternity is on this page, and it's where the parents were married after the child's birth, and then dad takes another action to show that he's really dad. So he signs the acknowledgement of paternity that gets filed with mom's affidavit. He consents in some form to his name on the birth certificate. I've never seen that one, but it was in the law. And the last one is also in the law, but I don't have any examples of that. The example I would use is that at the time of the child's birth, husband's married to mom, you got a presumption of paternity. 6 months later, there's blood testing that rules him out as dad, but he's still a presumed father because of the marriage. Well, this other man is then tested, and he's the bio dad. So again, you've got that presumption of paternity. You've got the blood testing, and you've got the man who was married to mom at the time of child's birth. So sometimes these paternity actions will sort that out and can take one man's name off of being dad and add another man's name to being dad. And what the courts have said is that blood will trump marriage. So if you have that blood testing, then that's the person that will be named as the father. And the case is Courtney versus Rogge, Western District 70143, just in case there's any attorneys that look at this DVD. We see a lot of these kind of cases in juvenile court. Kids come into care, you got two dads, you have natural fathers with biotesting, you got the legal dads married to mom at the time of the child's birth, but he's ruled out. It really becomes a problem at TPR if we don't have TPR grounds on both, because that constitutional piece, there's legal rights that attach to both, and consequently you've got to work with that father to have a TPR ground, or at least get him to consent to TPR. And my experience has usually been by the end of the case, they're willing to consent. But I don't think you can count on it. I don't think we can ignore him. We still need to work with that man who's married to mom at the time of the child's birth. These same type of presumptions that we've talked about in this case, the marriage, the blood, getting married after the child's birth, all of those presumptions are also used when child support enforcement is establishing who's dad. So there's some consistency between the two, and I think it just kind of helps to know that. Well, as we've gone through these, we've talked about legally undoing as we go. So in terms of paternity, there is actually a statute that says you can set aside one of these judgments of paternity or support. The acknowledgments of paternity, this is one of those where the guy's outside of 60 days to rescind it, and he's got to have a paternity action in order to get out of it. But it has to be filed within 2 years of the judgment. So the court order can cause support to cease and take a man's name off the birth certificate. And the real reason for this statute is the number of men in prison for criminal non-support who probably did what you were talking about, that notice of finding a financial responsibility that you might be baby daddy came in the mail and they just tossed it in the trash and thought, who cares? And so this statute was set out to try to remedy that. But again, it's only good for 2 years, so I need to know that. The adoption decree. This is just this comes up a lot, even though we all know that once a man and a woman, the husband and wife adopt the child, that it's their child for all purposes. But sometimes when the kids come back into care, when the adoption fails, and you've got the kids coming back into care, they're saying, well, does this mom and dad have to pay support? Do they have legal rights? Do we have to TPR on them? So I put this in there just to make it clear that adoptive father is a legal father.
Absolutely.
There's an adoption judgment, it's a final judgment, and he's dead. So what the clerk does for an adoption decree is the court orders the clerk of the court to send to vital statistics the order and the information to change and amend the child's birth certificate to add the names of the adopted parents. So that's how their names get on the birth certificates. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about child support enforcement orders, and I think we've talked quite a bit about your piece, so we can add it. If there's anything else you want to add on that, we can. But child support enforcement orders only establish paternity, support, and medical by that administrative order. They can't determine custody. So I think that's the most important piece on that. And then we've talked about your TANF application. Is there anything else you think we need to talk about on this?
No, I think the other piece about what you just said is that we have to educate dads, because they're paying. They've been court ordered to pay this. They're garnishing my wages, but I never get to see the child.
They're throwing his hiney in prison.
Right, and so he's very frustrated, and it causes him to have some resentment towards mom, resentment toward the child, and so he doesn't understand that next piece needs to happen, which if he wants to see his child, he's got to go to court and he's got to establish those rights. And so just explaining to dad those different pieces and how they interrelate to make a big picture is what's going to be really important.
The other thing too, when I think of the type of families we work with, a lot of times they don't have a lot of financial assets to be able to pay for attorneys to do a paternity court action. So, that's something to consider too when we're talking to them about it. You want to do this in the least cost method, a cost-effective way.
Which is sometimes why it's important to educate mom, because mom can voluntarily let dad have access, to that child. And so that's why sometimes the most work we can do with engaging dad is to work with mom, to engage mom to work with dad. And so educating mom just on the benefits of and all of that, and that child support, paying child support, is completely different than visiting, in that they're two separate issues. And so maybe mom will allow dad to have a relationship and what that looks like.
And you know, both parents should have a relationship with that child for a lifetime.
Absolutely.
And that child deserves that too.
Yeah.
Again, remember constitutional rights. Kids have constitutional rights too. That liberty interest, you know, I have to throw those legal plugs in every once in a while. The last part of the child support enforcement orders, I think slide 44, talks about the child support enforcement orders are docketed with the circuit court, and they're going to have the same force and effect of a judgment in terms of enforcing whatever the child support is ordered. So just so that they're aware of that. So I think we kind of we've talked about how dad gets on a birth certificate, and if he's a legal dad, he's on the birth certificate. So maybe we need to do a little summary of how does dad legally undo it. I think that's what this next section is. So we talked about a judgment of paternity will get you out of it. A judgment in a dissolution case that the child was not born in the marriage. We had that example. If the child's in care, you're under juvenile court jurisdiction. Terminating parental rights by consent or involuntarily will do that. But as a general rule, I don't know that the juvenile courts will do that when if you don't have a juvenile case for a child coming into care for abuse and neglect and you're moving towards a permanency plan. Just because mom wants dad's rights terminated because he's not paying support, we don't generally see that in juvenile cases. Yeah. Another type of the ways that he can legally undo it is if he signs the man married to mom at the time of the child's birth, signs the denial of paternity affidavit along with the mom and bio dad's affidavit saying that this other guy is dad. We talked about timely rescinding or undoing that acknowledgement of paternity. And then there's that real small piece where within a specific time frame, some of these judgments can be set aside. We've talked a lot about the default judgment piece and how we want to make sure that our dads know. And I think your way of engaging the mom and the dad, I think you really give a really good explanation of why the moms as gatekeeper and engaging mom and working with dad is so important.
Absolutely.
So the summary on legal dads comes down to where we started. He's a legal dad if he's on the birth certificate, even if he's not the bio dad, until he legally undoes it, and sometimes he can't.
Okay.
So we're going to move on to the topic. We've still got bio and natural parents to deal with and that putative father piece to deal with. So let's move on to the biological and natural fathers. The natural father to me is just a biological father, and we sure wish that we could assume that every man who says he's dad and is on the birth certificate is the dad, but we know that if there's questions on it, the DNA testing is how you produce who's the biological father.
Okay.
On putative fathers, the first slide kind of goes to that potato, tomato. You know, it's how do you pronounce the word? P-U-T-A-T-I-V-E. And my answer is kind of, well, it depends upon where your judge went to law school, but that's the legal piece in me. So it can be pronounced putative, or it can be pronounced putative. But what it's not is punitive.
Absolutely.
So sometimes we see that N in there. And just so everybody's clear on how the word is pronounced. So you can do it either way. And for those of you who know Mark Gutchin with Legal Services, I got an email from him after he looked at these materials, and he had the P-U in capital letters. So he actually pronounces it the same way I do. So what's a putative father? It's the person alleged to be the father. So I think the term putative father and alleged father, for our purposes in the real world, is pretty much the same thing. So it's somebody saying that he's dad. So maybe someone says he's dad. He tells others that he's dad. So maybe it's him saying I'm dad, maybe it's others saying he's dad. Another way that would be a putative dad is if he files with the putative father registry an intent to claim paternity. And we'll discuss what that means later on. But again, he's signing a document that says he thinks he's dad. So again, it's just a putative dad at that point. He may act like he's dad. He may pay support. He may live with mom and the child. You talked about the cohabitating. He may say he's dad. So what's really important on these type of dads is we want to get them into some sort of legal relationship because it's beneficial to the parent, and it's very beneficial to the child. And we've talked about that in the past.
I think for us, when we are working with a dad who's a putative, what that we need to do is to find out if he wants to move beyond that, and does he want to become the legal dad, and helping him and assisting him in how to make that happen.
That's a good point. Some of the courts have a different take on putative fathers, just so everybody's aware of it. And there are some courts that even if a man's name's on the birth certificate, they're going to require him to go out and do a legal action, a paternity action, to be declared the father, if it's just an acknowledgement of paternity, something like that. There are some courts that do that. There are case law reasons why they may want to do that. I don't think we can disrespect them, and they're the judges in the case. But just recognize that, the courts sometimes are going to treat these terms a little differently than we do. So let's talk a little bit about what the putative father registry is and what it's used for. And I'm going to go back to that constitutional piece that, if you're the dad of the child, you have these constitutional rights to the child. And the way the statutes used to handle that for adoption purposes and for other type of statutory purposes is they would publish on a John Doe, meaning the unknown father, a John Doe. And that statute actually was taken out of the statutes and was replaced with this putative father registry statute. And what the intent of it is to expedite adoption processes. So the laws have changed so that if a man thinks he's dad, then he's supposed to sign up with this registry. And then if that woman has a child within 9 months, then he would be notified of that event, and then he has to take some active steps to become a dad. That's the best way to explain this. And this only applies to the putative fathers. It doesn't apply to the legal fathers on the birth certificate, just so you know. In fairness to the father, like we said, and to make sure that the constitutional protection of due process is provided. If he signs up and he knows the name of the woman has the child, like I said, he will get a notification and he can institute proceedings. And then the other part of the putative father registry search is we have the ability, the Children's Division is statutorily entitled to search that registry to see if there's a name out there of somebody who signed up to be a dad. And the adoption statutes are saying if this child's going to be adopted out, then hey, you who wants to be the adoptive parents of this child, you have to search the putative father registry and make sure that there's nobody out there that might have some constitutional rights that we would have to deal with before this adoption process goes forward. So that's a pretty plain English definition.
And I know on our end that policy is very well defined, and so workers who are dealing with a father or an absence of only need to check with our child welfare manual, and they will give them specific instructions on how to access and who do we contact to access that database. And
that's good. That is really good. I think I put in here that there's an online form that we can print off at the Bureau of Vital Statistics, and you're right, it's in the manual.
Absolutely.
On how to that link on how to access it.
Yes.
Because I know you talk about this kind of stuff. I put a slide in here that kind of shows the form. It's not a real big piece, but the piece that's circled of it, there's a little bitty piece in that left-hand corner of that portion that says Notice of Intent to Claim Paternity filed. And then it has a box for yes or no. And that's what part of that process is. The other part of that has all these different ways we've talked about men's names getting on birth certificates. Those boxes can be checked. If there's a man's name on the birth certificate, it'll tell you how it got on there. These documents, I know it's hard for me sometimes when there's some new form or something that I need to fill out. I'm not wanting to do it because I don't know how to do it. This form is actually pretty easy to fill out. And for the 8 years I was a JO attorney, we use this form on a regular basis. So you just put in the information that you have on the child and the date of birth, who the mother is and what information you have. If you have information on the dad, you put it in there. And then they will send you back the completed form that sets it out. And because in most cases there's a juvenile court case, you can put the juvenile court case, you sign that you're the worker, that you work for the Children's Division, and then they will mail it back to you. In Jefferson City, I actually would run them through, and take them back. They were very nice to me on that. I think to finish off this piece before we start the dads in juvenile court jurisdiction, Pam, we're wanting you to talk about the critical role that fathers play in the life of a child.
I think despite who's the legal father of the case, all fathers play critical roles in the lives of children. We know that they're providers. And historically, dads have always been looked at as, if you will, the chief financial officer, the main breadwinner. Now that we've moved away from that to where we have dual income families, and sometimes it's mom who works outside the household and dad stays in, but historically, dad has played the role of a provider. Dad also plays the role of protector, and I think that's real important for us to kind of understand. Dad protects children, from things in the household like baby proofing and putting up gates and little plug-ins and all of that stuff, but he also protects children from outside harms. And whenever he needs to, he kind of steps in and plays that role. So if you're working with a dad who is not involved in the family or living in the household, that dad is going to feel inferior in that role if his child is harmed by another dad that is involved, for example, a boyfriend. And so he might internalize his failure to be a good provider when his child is harmed by somebody else. So we have to kind of recognize that is one of the roles that dad plays. Dad also played the role of nurturer. It looks completely different than what mom does. Moms are very openly expressive, emotionally, lots of hugs, kisses, things like that. And we may not find that it looks the same for dads. So, but I don't think we can rule out that dads provide a nurturing aspect for children. And then the last role that all dads play is that of a teacher. And I think sometimes it's an obvious role, like dad's your baseball coach or your basketball coach, but even whenever it's not a formal, dads still help with homework. Dads still teach you certain things. I joke with everybody, I'm a really good fisherman because my dad took me fishing all the time. So dads play those roles in many different aspects. What's important for us to realize is that when dads aren't successful in one of those roles, they tend to limit their time with the family. So if dad's not being the chief financial officer in his mind that he should be, he's less likely to spend time with his family. He'll limit his involvement, which is very frustrating to the Children's Division worker at times because we want them to be more involved. But we have to kind of understand that the research tells us whenever he's not being successful in any one of those 4 roles, then he's going to be harder to engage. So what might be helpful for us is to recognize that if dads are unemployed or underemployed, we need to really put an employment piece into our work with that dad to engage him back with his child.
That makes a whole lot of sense. Okay, back to the drier legal stuff. And we're going to talk about dads in juvenile court jurisdiction. So as you all know, this is a little bit more technical legal piece. And what it comes down to, while we may have to work with all these different dads at all the different points of service during investigations, FCS, assessments, newborn crisis assessments, all the different type of work that we do, a very small percentage of those cases end up in juvenile court. And when they do, the juvenile court is only going to recognize certain types of parents as a party to the case. And that's how we look at that. So we're looking at a Juvenile Court Rule 110.04A19. I'm sure you're just thrilled to know that. A parent is defined as a legal parent. Okay. It's defined as a natural parent. So naturally that's going to pick up the mom, and that because she gave birth to the child, and it will pick up if there's been paternity testing. The court's going to recognize, hey, this guy's been paternity testing, so he's got a little bit more of those legal rights, He's one of those presumed fathers. We need to deal with him. Well, actually, that term comes up. The adoptive parent, that's a legal, obviously there's been a legal action, and that presumed father. So we go back to the terms used in those paternity cases. So who's the presumed father? The man married to mom at the time of the child's birth. The man where the parents are, the child's born out of after the divorce, but within 300 days of divorce or death. You're talking about that 98% blood testing or higher. Again, there's that attempt at marriage, but that doesn't come up very often. That's invalid for some reason. And then we have the one where dad and mom get married after the child's birth, but he files that affidavit acknowledging paternity, as we talked about. So that's going to be those presumptions of paternity and whose rights have not been terminated. So when you think about it, so if there's been a TPR done, then they're not a legal father at all. So again, this is kind of a constitutional perspective on who has rights to be part of this court action when a child's been removed from the family. The other thing to note is that, Pam, do you see the name putative there anywhere?
I don't.
I don't. So see, we're going to have to be working with them anyway. There are actually some courts that will make a putative father part of the court case. And then, like I said, there's some courts that even if they've done an acknowledgement of paternity, the court's going to say, no, you have to go out and get an actual judgment of paternity before I'm going to recognize you as a dad. And that's going to kind of hurt us in terms of what we can do for permanency on the back end of the case if the kids don't go home. But that's a training for another day. So the other thing, well, we know we will work with any of these dads, whether they're putative, alleged, or any type thereof. And again, I think on the parent defined as legal parent, they're looking for the actual judgment type legal dads in that term. The one suggestion I have, and for these two slides, is what I see a lot of times is that workers put in court reports, they've got a legal dad. They just use the term legal. And you guys have access to records and stuff that show you what type of dads they are. And I think if you can put that in those court reports or in those removal affidavits, what type of dad it is, it's very helpful to the juvenile office, because they're trying to figure out if they have to apply this juvenile court rule, what kind of dad they have. So just in your court reports, if you want to call them legal dad, whether the court's going to think they're legal or not, if you're going to use that term, explain how you mean legal. You know, so talk about names on the birth certificate and this is how it got on there. So I think that helps you with that.
Excellent. I think it's also important just to take a look at, historically, public child welfare has not done a great job of engaging and working with dads. But if we're honest, we're not alone in that boat.
And I agree.
Family court, the juvenile office, I mean, we're all in that boat that we haven't worked well with or engaged with dads. And I think part of our job as the Children's Division is to advocate when we need to be advocating. And this is a population, the dads, who need a lot of advocating to make that system fairer to them. And so I think you mentioned the court reports, and I think it's extremely important for us to know that we are interacting with another system who is typically not treated dad as fairly as mom. And so maybe we need to provide lots more information on setting the stage as to who dad is and what the type of involvement dad's had to this point. Because if it's a non-custodial parent who doesn't have any child abuse and neglect background, it probably doesn't make sense to load him up with services that and create all these hoops that dad have to now jump through in order to be involved with his child's life. You know, whenever he maybe wasn't even involved in the family household that we got involved with in the first place. Oh,
I think that's a really, really good point. So you're looking at kind of that non-custodial, non-offending parent type. And I think there's some other perceptions out there that deal on this legal piece of dad with the idea is we only have to work reunification with mom.
Right, and I think historically that's what we've done, is only worked with mom, and if we have worked with dad, we've created a mountain that he has to climb over, and you know, it's just, our job is to help advocate for those who need advocating, and so I think right now the dads need advocating for in this system.
And I agree. And sometimes it comes down to, if we've got a non-custodial parent who's just not engaged and hasn't been around the family, who's the worst parent? The parent that abused the child, or the one that hasn't been engaged for the last couple of years? I mean, I think they're on the same footing with their constitutional rights, so we have to work with both. We're not just working with the parent from whom the child was removed. Our plan is not just to return it. You got to work with both. Give that child a shot at a relationship with both. So, but that's one of my soapboxes, so such is life. We do have to talk a minute about termination of parental rights. I think we're on slide 64. There's legal definitions of who you do TPR on when you're under the juvenile court system. I'm not talking about just a straight adoption where the TPR goes through as part of that. I'm just talking about defined for the juvenile court. It's a biological parent of the child, so that takes care of mom and that paternity tested dad, 98% or higher. The husband of the natural mother at the time the child was conceived. So ding ding, it's saying you have to do something with that dad who was married to mom at the time of child's birth. A parent by adoption. And it says that it includes both the mother and the putative father. But when you go to the next slide, it says, however, that putative father's got to, get his little hiney in motion and do something to make himself some type of legal dad to be part of this actions. And the bottom line is, again, when we've talked about it, working to identify the father, working with any legal fathers, and then the big D word, documenting all the work and including it in the TPR referral.
We've done a lot of work in educating the Children's Division staff on reasonable efforts and how we have to meet a reasonable efforts burden in order to even talk about termination of parental rights. And so I think it's just important when we're talking about dads today to realize, and you've said this, it took two to create the child. We need to make sure that we're working with two, because when we go in to terminate parental rights, the law requires us to terminate on two, and we have to make sure we've exhausted all reasonable efforts for both mom and dad, or mom and multiple dads, in order to get that TPR that we might need to get that child into permanency.
Okay. I think we've kind of hit the end of the PowerPoint, but we still have an activity to do. But I'd like to close up the PowerPoint piece, this training piece, with Pam, and let her spend a little bit of time on how you talk to and work with dads.
Thanks. I think there are just, there's basic differences between male and female. All you have to do is peruse a bookstore and you're going to see all of these books that are just Mars versus Venus and everything like that. And we have to realize that men and women communicate differently, they process differently, they just operate differently. And I think that's important to notice because we're a workforce predominantly of females trying to make sense of male behavior. And so what's important to any helping relationship can be particularly important to dad. And I kind of want to hit three pieces real fast. But, empathy, respect, and genuineness are super important to any relationship. But we have to be super careful because we need to demonstrate to dad that we are empathetic to his situation and that he's probably, he does have a lot of barriers against him. And our job is to help him address those barriers whenever we can. I think respect's important to males, and we don't want to do anything legitimate to give dad the feeling that we have disrespected him in this process. He's entitled to his thoughts and his feelings, and maybe we can assist him in how to deal with those effectively. And the bottom line is, we want to be genuine with dads. I don't want to feel like I'm sneaky. I don't want to feel like I'm using things that he says, running back and telling mom. I really need to respect the fact that maybe they aren't getting along and that there's conflict there, and not add to that drama, and maybe help diminish it so that we can get on with a more productive type relationship. I think what's helpful is if we look at father engagement as a process. I kind of like to look at it as a continuum from not engaged to engaged. And if dad's not willing to be able to visit his child every single day, like we would want, or every single week in a process, is dad able to call the child? Can he at least put forth a baby step? And we have to recognize that any movement from this side of the continuum to this side of the continuum is progress, and it's getting where we need to get, but just in smaller steps. Dads who haven't been engaged, and you're going to ask them to jump all the way in to fully engage, might be intimidating. And so we need to take it at the baby steps that we have.
Well, thanks for your help, Pam.
Thank you.
Okay, guys, now it's your task. You've got to complete the activity. I think it will take you approximately 20 minutes to do the activity. And I hope you have it printed off. Open book, which means you can look anything up. And hopefully, if you're doing these materials with somebody else, you can do it as a conversation with, which might actually make it go a little faster. But the exercise is called Who's Dad? And there are 24 different situations involving a dad, and you have no more knowledge than what's listed in that each particular one. So, and what we want you to do is categorize this type of father. And sometimes they might go in more than one category. So your first category is not a father at all. As you're reading about that type of person, are they not a father at all? Are they only a putative father? Are they a natural father? Are they an adoptive father? Are they a legal father? In terms of the way we've talked about legal. So, there's 24 examples, like I said, and so you want to read through each one of them and decide what you have. And then after your 20 minutes, I will give you the answers. Please note that, being the attorney that I am, I have a caveat at the very bottom of it. It says the juvenile court rules define parent as a presumed father, natural parent, legal parent, or adoptive parents whose rights have not been terminated. And I listed the rule number. Numbers 1 through 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, and 11 will also meet the definition of presumed father. So I'll give you your 20 minutes and then we'll discuss the answers. Okay, guys, how did the exercise go? It's a lot of fun to talk this stuff, but it's a little harder sometimes when you really have to try to apply it. So of the 24 examples, my first question to you is, how many of them were not a father at all? I'm hoping your answer is 3. And I think basically that tells you that you're pretty much going to have to try to work with any of those other men that are listed on this, because somehow or other they're some type of father. So which 3 am I talking about? I'm talking about number 8. Mom says the man is dead. Dad. So all you start with is a putative father. And he's been DNA tested as 0 as the dad. So he is no kind of dad. So you don't have to work with him at all. The next one that fits that category of not a father at all is number 10. We have mom and her husband divorced, and the divorce decree says there's no child born of the marriage. Remember, that's a legal finding of non-paternity. So he's not a father at all. He's off the hook if he didn't want to be involved. If he wanted to be involved, he might be some kind of kinship placement. And that's something that does come up. And the third one, where they're not a father at all, is number 14. There is a juvenile or family court judgment terminating that dad's parental rights. So again, he's not a father at all. And other than that, you have to work at everybody else that's on the list. So let's run through the answers. And if for some reason you don't think that the answer you got is sufficient for what you need, at the end of the PowerPoint and on the intranet is my information and my email and the ability to call me if you need to. And you're always welcome to do that. So who's dad? Let's start with number 1. I would call him a legal father. He was married to mom at the time of the child's birth, and he's on the birth certificate. So in the real world, he's going to function as a legal father. Number 2, the man married to mom at the time of the child's birth, who's on the birth certificate, but ding ding, DNA testing has ruled him out as the bio dad. Remember, this is one of those where he's a legal dad until he legally undoes it, even if he's not the bio dad. So this is one of those guys that you're going to be working with. And again, permanency with this type of dad, he may be considered kinship or something to place with.
Could be.
So especially when you're dealing with siblings where he might not be the father of say, 1 out of 4 of the kids. Number 3, the man married to mom at the time of the child's birth who's not on the birth certificate. Well, remember that statute says if they're married, the name shall go on the birth certificate. So we think that kind of makes him a legal dad. For sure, he's a presumed dad. He's going to have rights to that child in a juvenile court proceeding. So we're considering him a legal dad, even though his name isn't on there. And then number 4, the man married to mom at the time of the child's birth who's not on the birth certificate, but DNA testing has ruled him out. Okay, again, this is the one that's kind of on the common sense side, doesn't make sense. Again, he should have been on the birth certificate. He was married to mom at the time of the child's birth. That hits that presumption of paternity. His name should have been on the birth certificate. He's still a legal dad until he legally gets out of it. And the divorce would be a great way. A divorce case would be a great way to do it. Number 5, this is where we start hitting the affidavits acknowledging paternity. Mom was not married at the time of the child's birth, but she and the father signed the hospital affidavit, called an affidavit acknowledging paternity, that he's the child father. Well, he's the legal father. He's on the birth certificate. Number 6, Mom was not married at the time of the child's birth, but she and the dad signed the hospital affidavit, again, affidavit acknowledging paternity, that he is the child's father, but later on, paternity testing rules him out. Okay, he's still a legal father because his name's on that birth certificate, and until he legally undoes it, he's still a legal father. Number 7, Mom says the man is dead and he has been DNA tested at 98% or higher. Well, if you think about it, Mom says he's dead, so you're kind of starting with a putative father, but then he's been DNA tested at 98% or higher. So I think that makes him a natural father. That's really where he fits. So the answer to that one is natural father. Number 8 we talked about, not a father at all. Number 9, Mom and her husband divorced, and the divorce decree says the child was born of the marriage. Again, that's a legal finding of paternity. He's a legal dad. Number 10, we know, legal finding of non-paternity. And incidentally, the reason these examples are here is because most of this stuff happened to me during the 10 years that I tried TPR cases. All of these kind of examples came up. And so I think they're very relevant if you're in the AC world and you're looking at a concurrent plan of adoption. I think these are really relevant. Okay. Let's see, Mom and her husband divorced and a child is born 250 days later. Okay, I kind of hate to call that a legal dad, but for sure we've got a presumption of paternity. So we're calling that one a legal dad because they got divorced when she was pregnant. And that's one of those presumptions of paternity. Number 12, again, we got a legal dad. There's a court judgment, which, these are sterling, gold. Sterling or gold, I guess. This is a court judgment declaring dad's paternity of the child. Number 13, there's an adoption decree that the man is the child's father for all purposes. Now, again, that's a legal finding because you got a court judgment. It's an adoptive father. So this is one of those where you hit 2 examples. So you've got legal and adoptive. We talked about how 14 is not a dad at all. 15 starts our child support enforcement looking cases, and we talked about these examples. Family Support Division sends to the man a notice of finding of financial responsibility for the child. Okay, all you have is a putative father. Now, how in the world did I come up with that? Well, this is probably one of those where Mom needed some assistance. She goes and applies for it, has to cooperate with child support enforcement, so she has to name a father. So this is Mom saying he's dead, is probably what it is. But all it is a notice. It doesn't have the word order in it, so it's nothing more than that initial due process piece constitutionally notifying this man that, you may end up being the father and paying support for this particular kid. And the difference, the distinction is number 16, because that's the Family Support Division where they're sending a child support order. That's got the word order in the title. So that's a legal dad. We know that. Number 17, the man has been paying child support because of a child support order for years, but he lives out of state and has never had contact with the child. Now, these are our sadder cases, but hey guys, you got a child support order where he's obviously been made a dad. We consider that a legal dad. So even though he's not engaged, how's that for using the word, engaged in actually part of the child's life, he's still a legal dad in that case. Number 18, the man files a notice of intent to claim paternity with the putative father registry. I think we use this one as an example. He's a putative father because he says he's dead. Let's look at 19. Mom says he's dead and he says he's not. Okay. Mom says he's dead. So, these are the kind of cases where we're going to try to engage them and get the paternity testing in place to make those decisions. And Pam, feel free to interject anything along the way if you've got something you want to say. Number 20, the man says he's dead and Mom says he's not. Okay, again, you got somebody saying he's dead. So again, you want to resolve this with some paternity testing or whatever it takes and hopefully get that settled. 21, the man says he's dead and Mom says he's not. He's moved out of state and has no contact with the child for the years. you're still dealing with someone that mom says is dad, even though it's been a long time and he's been out of state. He's still one of those putative fathers that we're going to have to do something with. 22. Mom says the man is dead and he's in prison. Okay. You know, if was a child conceived before he went to prison, I'm not so sure that that's what you're looking at. I mean, that will give you some facts, but what you've got is mom saying that he's dead. So you've got to work from that and work through whether or not he is. Get the information, if necessary, get him tested. And the big thing about prison, you guys, is that you got a captive audience. So if there's an easy person to get paternity tested, it's going to be that inmate. They have their processes, and you have to fill your paperwork out correctly to say that he's in prison and give that information. But again, it's pretty easy to test then. 23, the man says he's dad, he lives with mom and the child and helps support them. Well, again, you've got a putative father. We'd sure like to get his name on the birth certificate, you know, have him take some sort of legal action to make himself a dad. And number 24, mom's relatives say the man is dad, but both he and mom deny it. I still think you have somebody saying he's dad. And if you think about it, when you're trying to figure out who dad is, sometimes mom won't cough up the name for good reasons or bad reasons. And you have to go to other relatives, and then you work through whoever they say. Or maybe there's an older sibling that happens to know who the child's father is, if you can have that conversation. So from 18 on down to 24, they are all putative fathers. And I hope this is applicable to your work. And I can't thank Pam enough for being here today and helping me with this training. And again, we wish you well.
Thank you.